So prostaglandins are extremely potent biological molecules that have kind of like a hormone-like activity. They get their name because they were originally isolated from seminal fluid produced in the prostate gland. And more recently, they have also been isolated from most tissues in animals. Prostaglandins are unsaturated carboxylic acids consisting of a 20-carbon skeleton that contains a 5-carbon ring. And there are several classes of prostaglandins, and they're grouped under designations like A, B, E, and F, and there's others, and I have a slide that will show that in a little bit. And the nomenclature of prostaglandins, which you don't have to worry about, I'm just explaining it, is based on the arrangement of the carbon skeleton and the number and orientation of double bonds, hydroxyls, carbonyls, whatever. So for example, if you have a name like, and this is just kind of an FYI because I won't make you do this, but if you have a name like, let's say PGF2, the PG stands for prostaglandin. The F indicates a particular group of prostaglandins, or basically like a core with a hydroxyl at a certain position. And the 2, so the 2 at the very end, that represents that we have 2 double bonds in the compound. Anyhow, it says here that prostaglandins are made in most tissues, but what's interesting about them in terms of their biology is that not only do they exert their effects on the cells that produce them, they also produce them on the cells in the immediate vicinity. And it even says right here in the slides that it can be very difficult to keep track of the many regulatory functions of prostaglandins. And so prostaglandins are involved in blood clotting. So blood clots form when a blood vessel is damaged, yet such clotting along the walls of undamaged vessels could result in what? A heart attack or maybe a stroke. And so thromboxane A2 is produced by platelets in the blood and stimulates constriction of the blood vessels and aggregation of those platelets. Conversely, there's another prostaglandin, which is called PGI2, which we call prostacyclin, and it's produced by the cells lining those blood vessels and is precisely the opposite effect of thromboxane A2. Prostacyclin inhibits platelet aggregation and causes dilation of blood vessels and thus prevents the untimely production of blood clots. Then in terms of an inflammatory response, or point 2, it says the inflammatory response is another of the body's protective mechanisms. Of course, when tissue is damaged by an injury, if you're cut, or if you get burned, or if you're invaded by a microorganism even, a variety of white blood cells will descend on the damaged site and try to minimize, whatever tissue destruction that has occurred. And the result of this response of the white blood cells is going to be swelling, redness, fever, pain. And what's thought to happen is that prostaglandins promote certain aspects of the inflammatory response, especially pain and fever. So drugs like aspirin, and I have a slide on this, they'll actually block prostaglandin synthesis and help relieve the symptoms. In terms of the reproductive system, there's a prostaglandin called PGE2 that stimulates smooth muscle contraction, particularly uterine contractions, and an increase in the level of prostaglandins has been noted immediately before the onset of labor. So there's strong evidence that painful menstruation suffered by many women can be the result of an excess of prostaglandins. Anyhow, drugs like ibuprofen inhibit prostaglandin synthesis, and of course that's been approved by the FDA and is found to be a safe way to relieve the symptoms. In terms of the GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, prostaglandins have been shown to both inhibit the secretion of acid and increase the secretion of a protective mucus layer in the stomach. And so in that way, PGs, or prostaglandins, help to protect the stomach lining. Because aspirin, so listen to this is interesting, because aspirin inhibits prostaglandin synthesis, if you use aspirin for too long, it can actually encourage stomach ulcers by inhibiting the formation of the new normal protective mucus layer while simultaneously allowing increased secretion of stomach acid. For the kidneys, prostaglandins produced in the kidneys cause the renal blood vessels to dilate. The greater flow of blood through the kidney results in increased water and electrolyte excretion. The respiratory tract, eicosanoids produced by certain white blood cells, like the leukotrienes, promote the constriction of the bronchi associated with asthma. Other prostaglandins can promote bronchodilation. So you can see that many prostaglandins have numerous and often antagonistic effects. That means one will have one effect and the other will have the opposite effect. And although they don't fit in the formal definition of a hormone, the prostaglandins are clearly strong biological regulators with far-reaching effects. So this is something that I put in here myself. This comes from a different textbook. This comes from an advanced organic chemistry textbook that I teach from sometimes when I teach organic chemistry too. But I just wanted to show you a little bit about all of these different PGs. So again, PG stands for prostaglandin, and that third letter, whether it's a PGA, like I thought they had something to do with golf, right? So PGA, PGB, PGC. So if you had spent a lot of time working or studying prostaglandins, you'd probably have to memorize all of these different cores that are shown here. And so, as I told you, it could involve the placement of a double bond or a carbonyl, right, or a hydroxyl. And after the PG and then the letter, the subscript represents the number of pi bonds in the side chain. Let me just show you one here. So this is PGE2. And here you see we have 1, 2 double bonds, and that's why they call it PGE2. And then if you look at PGE, which is up here, I'll circle it in blue. Okay, so PGE, you can see that we have the carbonyl here, and we have the hydroxyl pointing down like that. Even the R groups are in the correct orientation like that. And of course, you don't have to memorize that or anything. This is more of something that I thought would be really interesting to show you, just so you know, where do the names of prostaglandins come from. Anyhow, here's the structure of some other prostaglandins, and of course, you don't have to memorize those. It's just more of an FYI to look at. In terms of thromboxanes and leukotrienes, I won't ask you anything directly about the thromboxanes or leukotrienes. Suffice to say that they're both eicosanoids. And so all you'd really have to know is that they are eicosanoids, and that's good enough for me. So eicosanoids meaning that they contain 20 carbons. Like I said, I've never asked a question about either of those. The book doesn't go into a whole hell of a lot of detail about it. Anyhow, like I mentioned before, prostaglandins can stimulate the inflammatory response, and as a result are kind of responsible for the cascade of events that cause pain. And aspirin, a very commonly used drug, has long been known to alleviate such pain, and we now know that it does that by inhibiting the synthesis of prostaglandins. And you can see here that we have an active enzyme, and we'll go into this in more detail later on in the class when we spend a lot of time talking about enzymes. But it says up here that aspirin inhibits PG synthesis by acetylating cyclooxygenase. So cyclooxygenase is the name of an enzyme. Well, I guess it says it right there. An enzyme necessary for prostaglandin synthesis. But I know you all know what an acetyl group is, right? So here's the acetyl group right here, and you can see that what aspirin does is it transfers. So this is aspirin right here. That's the drug, aspirin. It transfers that acetyl group that's in red onto the hydroxyl, and it deactivates. Sorry, let me move this up. It deactivates or forms an inactive enzyme, and so it prevents the synthesis of prostaglandins, and therefore it alleviates the symptoms of inflammation and fever and pain. So kind of interesting there. And you're like, well, why can't I just suck down aspirin for the rest of my life and I'll always feel good? Well, I explained that earlier. It's really not a good idea to do that. Anyhow, in terms of the prostaglandin synthesis, the first two steps of prostaglandin synthesis release arachidonic acid from the membrane, and its conversion, of course, into PGH2 by the enzyme cyclooxygenase. These all occur in tissues that are able to produce the prostaglandins. The conversion of PGH2 into other biologically active forms is, of course, tissue specific and requires the appropriate enzymes, which are only found in certain tissues. Anyhow, so I won't spend a whole lot of time asking you anything about, the pathway of, cyclooxygenase, converting arachidonic acid into, thromboxanes and other prostaglandins. All right, let's move on to the next section, which deals with glycerides. Does anybody want to take a short break?